All right, folks, here we are. We're actually at the very last episode, I guess, of the Spoon and a Bear book club. It's been fun. It's been wonderful stories to share with not just what was in the book, but with talking with other folks, especially Greg and other people at the Bear Center. But we're down the home stretch right now, so we're gonna dive into the last three chapters and then kind of hopefully have some time to wrap things up and share some good stories before we start celebrating for the holidays. So with that, I'm gonna dive in. I think we're covering chapters. I'll tell you in a second, 24 to 26 today. So to get things kicked off. If you have read chapter 24, it's titled Hello Bear. And I know Greg will kind of have some maybe flashback memories of things like this, but what this chapter was about was just one of the normal days on the job being a bear biologist. And this is what I love, how special and how blessed and how fortunate we are, those that work with wildlife to be able to do really, really cool things. And some of the stories, like they're not always like really cool, wonderful. They're sometimes about when things go wrong. And I preach this all the time to my wife and others that usually those memories that last the longest or the most vivid over time are when things go not the way they're supposed to. So this particular story it was about us paying a visit. We're actually fostering a cub to one of the bears in the Smokies. It is actually off Cucumber Gap Trail. And we had two researchers there, Frank Van Manen and Don, and I forget what Don's last name was. This was almost 30 years ago. So, but is pretty neat because the two bear researchers from the University of Tennessee and USGS, they were kind of leading the way, and they had found these bears, or they found this female bear that was in her den, and she had two cubs of her own, and we were going to add one of the orphan cubs that I had at the time, the neonatal bears. And so once we get there, we obviously let the bear researchers do what they're supposed to do. And this bear was part of a large study that Dr. Pelton kind of was overseeing. And part of that study required studying aspects of the bear den itself, not just the bears, but where are they sleeping? So these two researchers, the first thing they did, obviously, you have to sedate a bear because even though it's wintertime and they're in the middle of their hibernation, because they use that torpor, that strategy where their body temperature does not drop that drastically, they can wake up quickly. And so obviously, for safety's sake, you need to sedate the bear. So Frank went in and used a jab stick and applied the anesthesia to the bear, and she went down pretty quick. And so all was fine and dandy. And so let me describe the place where this bear was actually hibernating. Is It was a giant old cucumber tree. It's a type of tree that was found all throughout the Smokies. And these trees got humongous. But this tree, the actual tree, was no longer there. All that was left was a stump. What year it got cut down, I couldn't tell you. But it was just the remnants of this giant tree. And all you saw was the base of it, kind of what's pictured here. And as you can imagine, there's like a tangle of spiderweb roots going down in there, lots of loose soil. So this bear, this female bear, had excavated out a little cavity underneath this root system. And what was really cool about this den is there was actually two entrances, one in the front, and then picture a similar but smaller hole in the back of the tree. And so both of the researchers, both Frank and Don, were able to get in there to start taking their measurements and doing whatever they were doing. And so myself and there's a couple other volunteers out there assisting that day. We were standing back while they were pretty much like this. They crawled into the den. Their legs were sticking out, and it's kind of comical looking at this. And we were sitting there talking, and everything was fine and dandy. And I swear, within 1/10 of 1 second, I look And Frank Van Man, one of the guys who was in the den, he's standing right next to us in a split second. And he's got leaves in his hair and his eyes were wild-eyed. And it's like, what the heck was going on? Because he looked frazzled, like like he saw a ghost, but it actually wasn't a ghost. What had happened is, as the two researchers were down in the bear den, here it is, a 200 and some pound female adult bear, formidable type of animal to be right next to. She was sound asleep, but the other researcher, Don, was, while Frank was taking measurements within the den, like the height of the den and the width of the den, Don was on the backside, and his job was to replace the radio collar because sometimes the batteries get weak and they want to replace the radio collar. So this is where it becomes really, really important to communicate with each other because as Frank is working, he is literally his face is 6 inches away from the female bear who's quote unquote sleeping right now. And as he's working, taking the measurements, Don was on the backside, unbeknown, well, out of sight of Frank, and he reached around to get the collar off, so he just lifted the bear's head. He forgot to tell Frank that that's what he was doing at that time. So as Frank is doing this, suddenly this bear, big bear, right next to him, suddenly lifts her head and is literally 3 inches from Frank's head. And at that moment, like I said, I never knew people could like walk on their abs, but the way he was positioned within that tree, he must have ran on his abs because he got out of that den so gosh darn fast. After we figured out what was going on, the funniest part is we're sitting there and Don was still down in the den and we just hear this laughing going on because apparently he saw Frank excavate his position pretty darn quick. So that had to be a great instance for Frank where it was just hello bear and he's out of there. So anyway, that was chapter 24.
Yeah.
Greg, you got any
Oh,
crazy
I was
predation questions?
laughing because I've had the same thing where you're working on a sedated bear and it moves its arm or it moves its head and and you look at everyone, you're like, hey, did you do that or did the bear do because
Yeah.
you're looking for signs of it waking up and you see the bear's head move sometime and someone's knee bumped it or something like that. So I thought about that because my reaction probably would have been the same thing if I wasn't aware that he was lifting the bear's head. Your instinct is, oh crap, face in my face,
Yeah.
right? So
And
yeah, and
you're in a compromised position because
oh
you're
yeah,
like on your belly, your arms probably can't move too well. And man, all you could be thinking about is how do I get out of here as quick as I can? So
yeah. I didn't know that those cucumber trees ever got big enough to be bear den size.
well, it wasn't in the tree. It was underneath the root
The
system.
base like rooted under, dug
Yes.
up the
Yeah.
base, and
So they
pulled
were
down.
underground. They were
Yeah,
more or less underground, and
yeah.
so the bear dug it out.
Not in the cavity, but still a pretty
Correct.
formidable base to get under. Yeah, because
Yeah.
they're aren't they kind of like a magnolia, like an umbrella magnolia or
Yes.
something? Or they're like,
Um,
but they're bigger. Because I'm like I've heard of them and I could tell you the saplings that I've seen and stuff, but I didn't know. But there are some big umbrella magnolias out there that you don't really know are
well,
big.
now you're making me second guess whether or not it was a magnolia,
Well, no,
or
I think
a tulip tree.
cucumber. Oh, a poplar,
Yeah,
tulip.
Magnolia
Yeah.
tulipifera.
Well,
This is science nerdy stuff where you remember scientific names.
I just know that the cucumber tree, I mean, this is just from Ryan probably grilling me on trees when I was an intern. But I think it was in the magnolia, or it's like a
Yeah.
magnolia tree, right?
Yeah,
It's
I'm pretty sure
magnolia.
they can get pretty big. There was nothing left of the tree. But it was just like a tangled mess of roots that the bear had excavated and they were underneath.
Yeah, Google says it can have a trunk diameter of 3 to 4 feet. So it's the
Yeah.
tallest and biggest of the native magnolia species in the Smokies. So yeah, I feel like, I've hiked Cucumber Gap Trail. I've probably seen them, but just not looked close enough at a big one. But you know what?
Well, I guess that's a good reason why it got the name Cucumber Gap.
Cucumber Gap, yeah, no, yeah, totally. And umbrella magnolias stand out a lot because their leaves, stand out to you. But sometimes you're looking at a tree and you're like, man, what kind of tree is that? And you look up in the leaves and it's a big tree and you're like, that's an umbrella magnolia. Magnolias get huge. They do, and
Yeah.
you don't think about it sometimes. You see them smaller and, ornamentals and stuff. So, but when you guys fostered, what time of year was that you guys fostered that bear? Was
That
it,
was it was I think early February, early
okay,
no, not early February. It was
oh,
probably
March?
more towards late February.
Yeah, yeah. Was it really cold out or was it kind of just
There was no snow on the ground. Um, yeah, I remember like we're dressed in heavier jackets, so it definitely wasn't like balmy out, but there was definitely no snow on the ground.
I've just in my experience going to dens, especially to foster, the moms are always in that torpor, and if you
Yeah,
sneak up on them, they might lift their head up and look at you and stuff. But if it's a really cold, like a hard, hard cold day, teens, single digits, and there's ice and snow on the ground, they seem to be more,
out of it.
down deep in that sleep versus I've bumped a bear out of a den before.
Yeah,
February day where it was kind of one of those warmer February days, like in the 50s and sunny and late February. And, it popped up as we're walking up to it. And it didn't have cubs, but it just shot up and, took off.
yep. All right, I'm gonna move on because my last chapter is my one of my bigger chapters. Um, Chapter 25, Killing a Bear with Kindness. I'll have you know, I kind of renamed this chapter to soften it up a little bit. But what this chapter is about, um, it's about some of the things that people do that they don't realize that they're hurting bears. And so one of the things I did, let me go back. Let me get that up. Um, there is actually a story, and I'm not going to tell you who's all involved or anything, but there was a bear inside the park that had been killed, and it had a broken neck, and there was there was an idea that maybe people were crowding it too much. It was kind of while the bears were still in the den. It was like early spring, and they discovered this bear had a broken neck, and so there was a thought of how a bear could actually break its neck, and I think the most logical point, or because we knew people were trying to visit the den, and so we think if a like just what Greg explained, if a bear is sleeping in its den and you disturb it, it can get up, but sometimes they're really groggy. It's like when you wake up first thing in the morning or in the middle of the night and you're walking around, you're stumbling and banging your toe and everything. And so these bears don't have all their faculties yet because they're in a deep sleep. And if they get disturbed and they leave their den and they climb a tree and then they kind of just forget where they are for a second, they can easily fall out of the tree and break the neck. There is no for sure answer like, but this was one of the best possibilities. And we knew people were visiting the den. And then there was a post about like from some of the people that love to chase bears all over the park about wanting to offer a reward to find the person that beat the bear with a stick. It was a totally concocted that didn't even make sense. And it just drove me batty because these people who think they're doing great things for bears can sometimes have really negative impacts to the bears. So what I did, the Wildlife for You was my little education business. This is back in May of 2019. So this is 6 years ago or so. And I was really seeing a lot of stuff in like Yellowstone, Yosemite, the Smokies. There's lots of photographers that love photographing bears, and I think it's a great thing. Obviously, if you see a bear, you want to take a picture. But when you get to the point where you're chasing a bear all over and you know where that bear is in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, where it dens, where it goes, where it poops, everything, you are harassing that bear. And so I wanted to write an article that really struck a nerve. And I titled it, I Killed a Bear. And it pretty much goes on. It gets you to say it, and it makes you feel sick to your stomach knowing that you could potentially kill a bear. And then it describes some of the actions that you yourself might partake in that you don't realize has a negative impact on bears. Like I said, I related about photographers chasing them all over the place, but then there's the people that either intentionally or unintentionally leave garbage out for bears. There's lots of things you can do that are not good for bears that could have negative impacts. Obviously, it might not be a direct killing of the bear, but it could. You hear the thing death by a thousand cuts, but those little scraps of food that people just commonly throw out or disregard can eventually lead to a bear dying. So it was just a wake up call to say, hey, if we want to do right by bears and do good things for bears, and we're going to start blaming people for all the wrong that they're doing, the first thing we ought to do is look in the mirror to make sure that we're doing the best that we possibly can because sometimes we're doing bad and we don't even know it. The thing I loved about this, again, this was 2019. The article itself was shared over 1,000 times. It had hundreds of thousands of views, and I thought I hit the big time because like back then you'd get like you'd write something and it'd have two or three hundred, and this had hundreds of thousands. So I was thrilled that the article went out as far as it did. But it's just a reminder to people that sometimes you yourself can do things that might not be in the best intentions for bears. And so just keep an eye on what you're doing. So anyway, if you have anything else to add, Greg, that's kind of the basis of that chapter 25.
Daryl, I remember you writing this because we got those cubs when I worked in the park and brought them to ABR. And I remember the photographers who were all involved, calling us, and I forget who actually reported the bear being dead outside the den, but somebody had told us already about this den, and it was off Forge Creek Road in Cades Cove. You guys know where that is, and the trail stomped there was tremendous, and it was all cleared, and we didn't know people had been there for months watching this bear in the den. And someone ratted on them. There was what photog. You know how the photographers are.
Mm,
Someone said, "Hey, there's all these photographers. They're watching this bear in her den with her cubs," and it was like the day or two after someone told us about it that she was dead outside of it. And we did the necropsy to find out what was the cause of death, and there was no trauma outside of the bear. It was just a broken neck, and the Dr. Ramsey was still at UT at the time, and he said the only way this neck break really happens is a fall. He's like, there's no other explanation without trauma to the outside. He's like, it has to be a fall. And so, Bill Stiver, my boss at the time, was like, the only explanation I've got is people were harassing the heck out of this bear, and she got stressed out, and she climbed the tree, and lost her balance, lost her grip, and what other reason does she have to climb the tree and fall with her cubs in the den?
right.
So we grabbed all three of those cubs, and they were all at ABR until the fall. They were released later because we didn't have anywhere to foster them. It was late. It
Right.
was late. I think it was late mid-March when that happened. And so we couldn't foster them. And that was the first experience I'd say it was one of the first experiences I had with people starting to really want to find bear dens and get that close. And then the next couple of years after that, Daryl, I mean, I had to go to Cades Cove every winter after that and find where these photographers were finding dens and post game cameras. And we were putting up game cameras everywhere and putting signage up and game cameras, and everyone knew the den was there, but they knew we had cameras out, and so they had to stay, a safe distance away. But that was silly that we even got to that point, right? It's like, hey guys, can't you let these bears like just leave them be?
Yep.
But I got to put up cameras and signs to keep everybody honest, and even at that, man, the amount of social trails stomped out right outside of the view of the camera was tremendous. And so it was sad because I was sitting there like, man, um these people say they love bears and they don't love them enough just to leave them alone and let them
Yeah.
sleep.
Yeah, and I have a love-hate relationship with like there's some photographers that I use all the time. I think they're some of the most ethical people. Certain photographers are very ethical. There's
Yeah.
others I don't really care for.
Yeah,
But
shout out to
just
Bob
look at
Bob
the
Howdeshell, right? You and Bob are good friends, right? Yeah.
yeah, Bob is wonderful. I've had him out here to help me with one of my student adventures, and he takes if you want to see pictures, he takes good pictures of bears.
Yeah.
But man, you should see the pictures of birds he had.
Birds. Yeah, his bird I've seen his bird
Oh
pictures
my
are
gosh, they're
ridiculous.
amazing.
Yeah.
So, but one of the big things that I've been keenly aware of, especially since I live out in the West now, is the whole 399
Yeah, and
issue.
Teton.
And that was just, if there was ever like bear paparazzi, she had it. She had like I tell people it's like Forrest Gump when he was running across country and he just had the crowd behind him. And so it's got to be a hard life for those bears. So anyway, that's what chapter 25 was all about. Just be mindful of your actions and just look in the mirror and just try to figure out if you could be part of the problem. And it's no big deal. We all make mistakes. Just
Yeah.
learning from your mistakes is
You know,
the best thing to do.
Daryl, one of the things I do say when I go talk to civic groups is I say, we can all agree that poaching a bear is bad, it's wrong, it's illegal, right? There's fines in place for poaching a bear. Um, if you're leaving trash and bird seed out and letting a bear have food, you're feeding it on purpose, you're a poacher, and you're just as bad as the poacher. The difference is, for whatever reason, when that bear's killed, you're not fined $5,000 like the poacher is, And that's one of my things I present to people to try and get people to advocate for laws against feeding. Because I'm like, hey, what's the difference in doing this and poaching right now? It's no different in the end result.
I will tell you the lesson learned from this particular article. Titles sell stories because
Yeah.
it was titled "I Killed a Bear," and people wanted to find out what was going on. And I hope they read the whole thing because it tells a little bit different story about looking in the mirror. So,
Yeah, and I just want to comment too, Daryl, of like, it's really obvious when it's poaching. It's really obvious when it's, even a bear getting into trash. It's really obvious when um
Someone's feeding it.
someone's feeding. Yeah, but like, and like I'm gonna tell a story about ABR. Like we've had a bunch of construction people around the facility this year, and we haven't had any cubs, right? But we've had a few folks that are like friends of ours who also, are working in some of these jobs. And, we haven't done a great job of reminding them, hey, you need to lock your equipment before you leave, right? Because obviously no one's really going into the woods. No person's going into the
right.
woods to like steal stuff. But we had a bear get into one of the guy's equipment,
And chew the seed up. Yeah.
and chew the seat up and then get like a piece of his lunch, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like even ABR, who will, tell you to lock your car or lock your
Yep.
whatever till the cows come home. It's just like the reality of, and I tell people at the visitor center all the time, unfortunately, living in this dense of bear country, like you'll know when you make a mistake because oftentimes the one time you forget to lock your car, or, the one time you forget to latch your bear resistant trash can, like that's when the bear finds it.
Yep.
Uh,
Oh, well, I will tell you, like back when I was at ABR, so late 90s, living in that trailer, there was, I don't want to say there was no such thing as bear-proof trash cans, but we didn't have bear-proof trash cans. And I could I probably need at least two hands to count the number of times where I'd wake up in the morning and the cans, I would have to go looking for it because it was dragged across and so it was a problem that we were fighting, and I knew it was an issue, but sometimes, yeah, sometimes we got to look in the mirror and say, "Are you part of the problem?" So, all right, that is gonna take us to the very last chapter of the book, folks. So, chapter 26 is Deacon, a miracle cub, and this is actually where I got the title of the book, and you'll understand in a little bit. But give you a little bit of background information on this particular bear, the story. It was actually the 4th of July, which wasn't really doing too much, but I was a little surprised when I got a call from TWRA about a cub that one of the officers was trying to catch. Um, I'm trying to think if it was Washington. I forget what county, but it was a little bit north of the park. And they asked if I could go meet the officer. I was able to get a hold of him, and he was able to capture the cub, but he couldn't drive it all the way down. So he was wondering if I could drive up and meet him in the parking lot. And this is gonna tell you how old it is, old, old we are, but it was the Kmart parking lot, not the Walmart, but the Kmart parking lot. And I think is John's. I don't know if it was north of the park somewhere, but not a very big city at all. Anyway, I drove all the way up there, and by this time it's kind of getting a little bit dark. There's still enough daylight, but thankfully there was nobody in the parking lot. Obviously, 4th of July, things were closed. And so I pulled up in my Jeep. He had his green pickup, TWA pickup truck. And so I didn't know much information about the cub other than it was about 20, 25 pounds. And so I showed up, and the bear was in the back of his truck in a cage. And so I had very minimal experience with bears, but I knew enough that a 25 pound cub could put up quite a fight. So I was donning my big heavy gloves, the bite resistant gloves, a catch pole. I was getting all the gear ready to have a wrestling match because I had to get the bear out of his cage and put it into my cage, which was a dog carrier. And as I'm donning the gear, officer's kind of looking at me weird. And he's like, "Watch this." And he walked over to the cage where this cub was, and he opened up the door. Freaked me out for a little bit because I'm like, had fresh memories of Houdini going on. And so he opened up the door, and sure enough, the bear bolted right out of the door, but it jumped right into the officer's arms. And he was more or less holding it like a toddler. And right then and there, my jaw dropped because he walked by me, put the cub in my cage, closed the door, and I was standing there still slack-jawed when he bid me farewell and drove off. So I now had this bear cub in my possession, supposedly going back to the bear center to rehab this bear to return to the wild. And my mind was scrambling because the bear center was set up to rehabilitate wild bear cubs. Habituated food condition used to people like being cuddled by people cubs were not in our vocabulary. We were not supposed to handle those bears. So I was somewhat in a little panic. And so I was driving back to the bear center with this cub in tow, and he more or less was just laying in the back of that dog crate, and it's kind of weird because like I could hear him. He was kind of congested, kind of wheezing a little bit. And so during the drive, I made some calls, and I talked to Walter Cook, who was the captive animal person for TWRA. He was the one that gave us the permit to operate. And I told him what we had here. And typically we want to take these bears, but I think that Walter kind of saw the problem in that a TWRA officer gave us the bear. So it wasn't that we wanted to go get this bear, we were given the bear. And so we were scrambling trying to figure out what we're going to do with it because obviously we can raise this bear um, to be nice and healthy, but we cannot house this bear. And a bear, if a 25-pound bear was willing to jump in your arms, can you imagine what that bear is going to do when he's 200 pounds? And so it was a situation we had to figure out. Needless to say, I drove this bear back, and the one thing I forgot to mention is the officer told me that he picked him up on Deacon Road. So I'm like, all right, that's a good name. We're gonna name this cub Deacon. So I drove back to the bear center, trying to figure out what to do with the bear. Everything was good on the ride. When I was getting the bear situated in the maintenance building, he was still kind of relaxing in the pen. And suddenly he made a noise which I never heard a bear do before. He coughed. And I'm like, that's not normal. Bears don't typically cough. If they're eating something and they choke, they might cough that way, but this bear was not doing anything. And I could hear the wheezing in his chest. So I called Dr. Ramsey. I told him what I had on hand, and he said, bring the bear by in the morning. So next morning rolls around, load the bear up, drive him all the way to the University of Tennessee, and Dr. Ramsey has him at the vet for a number of hours. They're going to do a whole bunch of diagnostic tests on this bear to figure out what was going on. Finally, they called me, and Dr. Ramsey said, "You can come get the cub again, but I'll tell you what we found." And so he was explaining to me that the bear had aspiration pneumonia. And so, more or less, what that means, his lungs were filled with fluid. And what Dr. Ramsey believed, and it makes perfect sense, especially seeing the behavior of that bear, is that the cub was captured near someone's house. And even the officer said he's almost certain this bear has been fed by humans the whole time. And Dr. Ramsey believes that whoever was trying to care for this bear, how they got their hands on it, we don't know. But whoever was trying to care for this bear was probably trying to bottle feed it. And if you know anything, I could put this up. Now, I will tell you, this is not a picture of Deacon. I had to steal this picture from somewhere else, but they gave him a thorough exam. When the person who was holding this cub tried to feed it, they probably more or less held it like a baby, where you lay the baby on its back and you put the bottle in the mouth. That is not how bears feed. Bears usually crawl up on mom's belly, and the bear is sternal. The cub itself is typically on its belly and it's drinking that way. And so if you flip the bear upside down and roll the bear on its back, especially if you're using a bottle that is not designed, it might have a little bit bigger hole in the tip of the nipple, it can get more fluid in the bear's mouth than the bear can swallow, and some of that goes into the lungs. So Dr. Ramsey did a fantastic job explaining to me what was wrong with this cub and that there were some pretty strong medications he was going to prescribe. So I'm like, all right, well, this is what we're here for. I'll deal with that. Our big thing is finding a home for the bear. And then Dr. Ramsey kind of took the wind out of my sails. He's like, there's a really good chance, he said, don't be too surprised if the bear doesn't make it through the night. And that kind of knocked my socks off because I did not think it was near as bad, but he went on to explain that the fluid, it was more fluid in the lungs than he's ever seen. And he says the bear's in really, really bad shape. So he gave me the cub, put it back in the Jeep, and I was driving back to the bear center. And it was like one of the worst drives because it's like I'm just driving this bear home for him to pass away during the night. And so it was a sick feeling, but I thought to myself, you know what? I love bear. I don't want any animal to suffer. So if this is going to be the bear's last night, I'm going to try to make it as good of a night as I possibly could. So I knew the bear was hungry. So when I got back to the bear center, I put him in the maintenance building, which is that block building. What do you call that building nowadays?
It's the Red Roof Recovery
The
Center
Red
now.
Roof. Yeah, that's the building I'm referring to.
Looks a lot different now.
Yeah, definitely. So I put the bear who was still in the dog carrier, put him in that building, and I went up to the trailer because I'm gonna feed this bear, but you know what? It's kind of like those people on death row where they get their last meal, whatever they want to eat. I felt the same way because I felt so bad for this cub, whatever he wanted. Now, we typically we had the standard fruits, apples, grapes, things that the bears should be eating. But I'm like, you know what? I've got, I was rummaging through the refrigerator, and my wife's like, "What are you doing?" Because I grabbed some bacon out of the refrigerator and a little jar of peanut butter. And I told her the story, and she's like, well, I'll get an apple pie for you too. But we didn't go that far. We just went with bacon and peanut butter. So I went back down and I sat outside the cage for this little guy who wasn't doing so well. He was still wheezing. And so I knew he jumped into the arms of that wildlife officer. So I was a little nervous because I had no history with this bear. So I kind of just stuck the tip of my finger in the cage. And Katrina and Greg, you know this, they'll kind of suckle on it like they're nursing. And so I would put my knuckle through the cage and it would suck there and it would start to hum, do the just they're so happy and content when they're doing that hum. And so this bear was definitely comforted by my presence. So for the next, I don't know, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, I was feeding him really good stuff. Like some of the bacon, I gave him his medication in the bacon and dipping some of the apples and stuff in the peanut butter. So he was loving life. And I was kind of having fun too, because never do you get this close in contact with a bear that we're going to be releasing. And so I knew that that was not a possibility with this cub. So as I'm sitting there, um, I'm like, all right, it's time to go. So it was getting late at night. I bid him farewell, wished him luck. I went and I left. I closed the door to the maintenance building and go back up to the trailer where I was living at the time. And as I'm closing up the door and shutting the lights, he is screaming, he's bawling, and it was tearing me apart. So I went up the trailer and I'm filling out the paperwork. I'm writing the notes, what was going on. And I sat down in the recliner I had, and all I could think of was that bear crying down there, knowing that he was comforted by me. So I'm like, I told my wife, I said, you know what? I'm gonna go back down and spend some more time with the bear. So I went back down and it was so cool because he was just doing that low whining because I had been gone so long. He was just doing that low whining. He was still pretty upset, but as soon as I turned the doorknob, he perked right up. And when I came in, he was his happy self again. So it made me feel good that I made him feel good again. So we sat there for a little while and he was doing that little sucking on my knuckle. And the evil, I don't know if it's the evil part of me that got to me, but I'm thinking, you know what? The officer did it. This is the bear's last day. How much harm would it be if I just let him get out of the cage, especially if he was more comforted being around me? So, against my better judgment, I don't recommend this. I don't tell any of your other curators to do this, but I'm like, I'm gonna do it. So I opened up the cage and I was a little worried because all I've dealt with wild bears. I've never handled a bear this size before in my bare hands. And I opened up the cage and it was like it was the first time he saw me in like 20 years and he like just jumped in my lap and he wasn't really hugging me, but he was curling up in my lap. And he was just so happy. He was humming. He was just so glad to be out of the cage and just like in my arms. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is the coolest thing. So I spent about an hour. Eventually, he crawled down and was just kind of working his way around the maintenance building, sniffing things. But he was always close by to me, and so spent a couple hours with him doing that just to make him comfortable. And then by this time, it's getting close to midnight, and it's like, all right, buddy, I gotta get you back in the cage because I gotta get to bed. So I go to pick him up, and I was able to pick him up no problem. But when I carried him to the cage and go to put him in the door, he went spread eagle, paw, paw, foot, foot, like grabbing the corners of the cage, and he was not going in. It was like I was pushing on his hind end. It was like a little trampoline. He was not going to go back in that cage. So I stopped for a second. Then I figured, okay, I'll pick him up and throw him in real quick. And he read my mind because I picked him up, and as soon as I made a motion to the cage, he whirled around and just wrapped his paws around my leg. And at that point, you could feel his claws sinking in. I'm like, well, this isn't a good idea either. So I sat there and I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm kind of got myself in a predicament here. And so looked around the maintenance building. It was just had a bunch of clutter, but there's a couple of bags of the dry dog food that we had on hand. We had a tarp. I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna lay down here. Hopefully he's gonna start getting groggy and maybe I'll be able to pick him up and put him in once he starts falling asleep. So I laid down and he just kind of milled around and I was exhausted. Before I knew it, I fell asleep. And I don't know if you've ever experienced this. I've done it a couple of times. Even on that trip with Bill. Um, but like in the morning when I'm waking up, like my faculties will start coming back, but my eyes are still closed and then kind of start thinking about what's going on. And I was thinking, man, that was a really cool dream I had. But then it's like, what the heck? Was it a dream? And I opened my eyes and lo and behold, I was asleep on the floor and the cub was curled up like literally in my arms. And so I woke up spooning a bear. And like before I lost the ability to get him back in his cage, I picked him up and he was still kind of out of it. I was able to put him in the cage and close it up. Anyway, as the day went on, um, I realized, you know what? He's awake. He's doing good. He wasn't supposed to survive the night. And so this was a good thing. I called Dr. Ramsey. He says, if he got through that, who knows what's going to happen with this bear? Just keep giving him the medication and we'll see what comes of him. And so sure enough, I didn't take him out of the cage anymore, but I kept feeding him the medicine, put him back on the proper bear diet, and he started pulling through. His lungs were clearing up. Dr. Ramsey looked at him after a couple of weeks. The fluid in his lungs was almost gone, and so we were able to save this bear. I'm going to stop the story right there because we didn't save the bear. The success story with the Bear Center is when we get a bear in, whether or not it's orphaned, injured, whatever happens, the success story is when we return that bear to the wild. We are there for wild bears. It broke my heart because we had to find a home for this bear. We could not let that bear out into the wild, knowing that he wants to jump in someone's arms. It's just irresponsible, not just for humans, but for the bear itself. And so, fortunately, TWRA was able to find a sanctuary down in Georgia where we were able to send this bear. Now, this is not a picture of him either, but this is the moral of the story. As much as it sounded like a success, when people do wrong by the bears and feed these bears, if they don't end up dead, which most of them likely do, they're going to end up with a life like this. And this is almost, in my eyes, almost worse than what I just said because bears are meant to be wild and free. They're not meant to be behind cages, used as pets, sitting in a sanctuary because they can't be released. So Deacon was a miracle cub, and I promise you, there's probably not many people on this world that have woken up spooning a bear that they really didn't mean to be doing, but that was probably one of the greatest experiences of my life. It was a neat experience because, put it this way, I've been on Facebook a couple of times where whatever forum it was, they're like, "All right, what's your greatest wildlife experience?" And I get on there and I say I woke up spooning a black bear, and like everyone, oh, real funny, and like no one believes me, but like, it's a true story, folks. So anyway, that was the last chapter of the book, and that's where the title "Spooning a Bear" comes from. And again, I don't recommend any curators or public do this, but it kind of happened on accident, so that's why I ended up writing about it. So anyway, what's your, if you don't mind me asking, Greg and Katrina, do you have your greatest feel-good story with any of the bears that you cared for?
Man, well, Daryl, we have survived some bouts of pneumonia only to have some terrible things happen
Yeah.
afterward. So we won't,
Yeah.
as everyone here knows, they can survive pneumonia. I think part of that story resonates with me is some of these bears that we've had, and I've brought bears from the park before to ABR that I just thought had zero chance. One Katrina actually was with me is when she worked in the park as a seasonal for us. We had a cub that was hit by a car at the Elkmont campground entrance, and her name was Myrtle. If you guys remember, it was only a couple of years ago. She was unconscious for a solid hour before I got there and laying in the middle of the road. It was October, so she was a bigger cub. She weighed almost 25 pounds. But she had blood coming out of her nose. And I was just like, this one's probably got no chance. But she did startle a little bit when I got there. And the mom was still there with the other cubs, but she startled and like was breathing and crawled off the road and then like just curled up in a ball. And I decided I was like, I can dart this bear with a half CC dart, and I can look at it closer and see what it can do, and I can get it to the vet. The nice thing about ABR now, and like back in your day, you didn't have the ability just to run a bear to the vet and pay for anything and everything all the time. You guys didn't have much money, right? But I'm like, hey, I'll bring this bear to the vet. I know ABR will pay for it and see what the chances are. And so that cub, I think it was probably one of Katrina's first cubs we brought to ABR when
Mm.
you were working in the park, but made a full recovery. Just had a concussion, just had a little bit of blood coming out of its nose, and I've brought others since with similar conditions. Head trauma where you just think this thing's been unconscious for 2 hours, it can't possibly have a chance, and they recover. It takes them a couple days. If you don't have an environment where you can contain them and feed them and water them and let them recover and get their brain, swelling down and get their
Yeah.
movement pattern back. But, that's a cub who would have died on the side of the road there because it just wouldn't have had a chance to recover. And we were able to bring it somewhere and recover and release it back in the park 6 months later. And, that's pretty cool when you're the one who brings it in also and you release it. And,
Yeah.
it doesn't do any harm and it only does good in terms of balancing those scales of this human conflict. And I wrestle with this philosophically because I love the park so much, but man, there's not a lot of benefit to the bears or any other natural resource by having 12 million people stomping around a mountain wilderness, in a year. And even though the cubs we release now, certainly don't really have an effect on the population. It's like, man, can't we give them something?
Yeah.
Can't we just give them a little like, it's really not fair what we've done. Can we just try to balance the scales a little bit? We're doing a bad job of it, realist on the grander scale, but at least being able to pick that cub up who gets hit by a car and say, hey, you weren't supposed to die. Nature didn't really intend for that cub to die. And, killing that cub would be illegal, right? That's one of the things I always go back to. It's like if someone were purposefully killing that cub, if a human did it on purpose, it's illegal. When it happens on accident, does it make it any less valuable?
Right.
We value the cub. If it's illegally killed, we value it. And I tell people this, I'm like, if we don't value bears, why do we have any hunting seasons and rules and fines related to them at all? If we didn't care about them, we wouldn't care about them when someone kills it illegal. We wouldn't care about it ever. So if we're going to care about them in these certain circumstances, we need to care about them in all circumstances to be consistent with our own,
Yeah.
management flaw. And that's what's cool to me is like seeing that people like you and Kim and everyone cared enough to say, "Hey, we can do this." Is it a little bit of extra work and is it kind of hard? It is hard. It's hard to, caring for that cub with pneumonia. I bet that was a lot of work for you, right? Giving it
Oh yeah.
feeding
Spe-
cleaning it and giving it food. It's a lot of work and you invest a lot into that individual and seeing it pull through and seeing how tough bears are. We've got a lot of followers. There's probably some people here who have been through some tough medical spells. And we get people telling us, they're like, man, watching these bears pull through some serious conditions inspires some of our followers who are dealing with, some serious health conditions. We've had folks call us. They're like, this bear back this year had the broken leg. I had broke my hip the same year. And, I followed along recovering alongside that bear. And And these cubs give people strength, as crazy as that may sound, so that's what makes me feel good. What about you, Trina? What makes you feel good?
I can follow
You
that
gonna follow?
though. Uh,
Sorry.
I think I mean I echo a lot of what Greg has said, but um and I'll tell this to people to like house come home, but ABR is just a place for the bear to come and recover. We give them food, we can sometimes give them the medical necessities, whether that's medicine or antibiotic, they give
Yeah,
medicine, antibiotics, or
surgery.
surgery or things like that. But in the end, it's still like the bear's will to live, and I believe that bears have some will of some sort. However you want to look at that, but we just help them along, right? We're not, like the same way we're not teaching them how to forage, we're not teaching them how to climb trees, we're not teaching them, how to crack a peanut
Yeah,
open.
we don't teach them how to be bears.
Yes,
Yeah,
they well, and what's almost so beautiful about it is they teach each other how to be bears. One of the more habituated bear cubs we got in last year, she was, found by some guy, and then she
yeah.
was kept
Some
in
some TikTok influencer.
his home for like 3 or 4
Yeah.
days, and was with his wiener dog like on TikTok, right? And so, but once we introduced her to some other more quote unquote wild cubs, the cubs rewilded each other. Or like Subaru Bear, who, and this is not the first time this has happened in ABR history, where she comes in with a leg injury. She gets surgery. They ended up, you know, putting a
Yeah, put a plate in her
put
one
a
leg.
well, it wasn't, no, it wasn't a plate. It
Sorry, a
was it
pin,
was a
a rod. It
kernel,
was a
which was the
yeah,
whole problem. But anyway, she healed from that, but then broke her other leg while she was healing from
yeah.
the other thing,
She got a stress fracture in the other leg from overusing
from
the
overusing.
other leg. Yeah,
We ended up having to put her in the tiniest little, like literally just moving her from one cage to another because she couldn't stand up because she was trying so hard. And she recovered from that. She actually hated humans more than any other bear ever that I've seen because she's like, I'm so sick of getting poked
yeah.
and prodded
And we
and given medicine, and
moved her from cage to cage every day to feed and clean and give her
and
medicine.
she, controversial, got pneumonia, kind of got pneumonia, recovered from it, and like obviously her story didn't end well, but like theoretically, in the next couple of weeks she was supposed to be released back into wild, right? And that was just like a human caused issue that we were able to fix, kind of like Greg said. And yeah, maybe that specific bear doesn't matter to the population, but like that bear matters. And
Yeah.
that specific bear has a story, and it has likes and dislikes and all those things. And people, like Greg said, relate to it. And I think
Yeah,
this is how I feel about it, Daryl. And I think we talked about this. Despite a lot of scientific people who want to say that you shouldn't use anthropomorphic language, which I think can be problematic in a lot of ways, but humans don't care about things they can't relate to.
Hmm.
They just don't. And so if you
yeah,
can't have, and also just to downplay bears' emotions or like preferences or even personalities, like
behaviors and
it sounds silly, but I could tell you, one bear versus another in a enclosure just based off of behavior, and I
Yeah.
think that reality is what brings me back to them over and over again, of just like being in awe of them. That was such
And you guys probably had like way more, like much higher numbers, but I think the most bears I had at one time were 13 cubs, but they're all almost identical in size. They all came in within like the same month or so.
yeah,
But I can go down there and I can tell you exactly which bear was which. They were all mixed together,
yeah,
and I can almost guarantee like some people would probably be like, "Yeah, you don't know the difference," but I knew each bear. Oh, so and so loved being up on that branch, and then the two together that always play by the little pond there. That's so and so, and so you definitely bears have individual personalities for sure.
yeah. Baranalities, yeah. And yeah, and Daryl, with the sanctuary stuff, I think that's a great, thing to point out. Like, I don't like going to zoos, Daryl.
I
I
don't even.
I don't like seeing large animals in captivity. I don't probably shouldn't like seeing small ones, but something about seeing large carnivores, predators, even large herd animals. in captivity for their whole entire life, their whole existence. I just I
I
don't
under
like being there. I understand the point, and I
Yep,
can get behind the conservation aspects of zoos
the
and the education.
education and
Yeah, I can, but I want bears to be as wild as possible, and if I don't like a bear getting fed at someone's house, um, you know, that's really not as bad as a life in a zoo for a bear. A life in a zoo is worse than a bear getting fed in the backyard.
I agree wholeheartedly. And I've had a number of people ask me if I ever went to visit Deacon at the sanctuary. I never did. I did not want to see that photo that's up on the screen.
Yeah.
That's not that would tear me up knowing that he just spent how many years like in a confined area. And so it was a success story that we saved his life, but the fact that somebody ruined him, they ruined that bear's life. And so I was glad that he was able to survive, but I personally don't want to see that.
And our enclosures are more space, more
A lot of
enriching environment
sanctuaries.
than any we've got an acre for six bears now
Yeah.
is what we're doing. Six cubs. They're not adults, they're cubs. It's more room than any animal has at a sanctuary or a zoo. Typically I'm sure there's some really good ones. And I know there's some in Canada that have
Yeah.
massive amount of
A
land.
few acres.
Some few acres for them. But for a cub in our environment, especially without the stress of people looking at you every day, you can tell. We actually have data, Daryl. I don't know if you knew about this. The vets did some pre and post release stress hormone surveys on our cubs a couple of years ago,
Yep.
and all of the
Using
stress
hair.
yeah, all the stress hormone markers in hair. So long hair holds a long-term profile of hormones in it. And so using hair, they saw a lower stress hormone upon release than upon being brought in. And if we know that our environment is less stressful than whatever that cub was going through in the wild, on its body, then we know we're doing something right.
Yeah.
you
Yep.
know
Um, got to break away real quick. I
oh
ended up doing a crazy thing the other day. I don't know if you can see, where is she? Oh, I got another dog.
is that a new dog?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I lost my dogs within the last few years, but I ended up going to the shelter with my $10 in my hand and came home with a new dog. Her name's Ochre, after the Ochre Mountains that are the backdrop to my house. So,
All right, yeah, congrats.
yeah. Anyway, well, Greg, we're just over an hour again, so we've been hitting it pretty good with these hour-long talks.
Well, all I can say, Daryl, is thank you so much for being willing to do this. And everyone will be in touch about some future things. We're definitely going to have Daryl back around. If I can coax him to move back to Tennessee uh, and
You
move back.
coax my wife like you don't even have to coax her. You just
Oh, really?
yeah, find a
Hey,
place for her to live and a
we
job.
got we Daryl, we've
No,
got a
no, she
place.
she can't do that
We've
again.
got a place for you to live. You've lived there before.
I live, yeah, that's true.
You got to check it out again when you visited. It was
It's
I
so far.
don't tell this to anyone, but I was already looking at Zillow at house prices.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we'll get you back on here, everybody. We'll have other guests through the spring. And we've got an update coming for you guys on the project. The fence guys are going to come out and finally finish patching up the holes in the fence we had to put in it to put in our storm drain. And we'll have the fence done. We'll start working on electric. And then we finally have finalized our process with the soil study with TWA. So we've got some announcements for that. We've been going back and forth with them a lot, finalizing our plans and our protocols, and we finally have the go ahead. So we will get that done ASAP this winter and spring, and we'll do everything we can to satisfy all of the recommendations and needs of the agency. So,
That's great. Great to hear, Greg. If you don't mind, I'm going to close it with a
yeah,
catchphrase from my wildlife business.
go for it.
And I always tell people, remember, folks, when it comes to wildlife, it's your knowledge which often means their existence. And so the more you know what you're supposed to do to peacefully coexist with wildlife, the better off wildlife will be. So Anyway, with that, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I look forward to carrying on further conversations with everyone. So appreciate it, guys. And with that, I will bid,
Holidays, everybody.
Yeah. Bye, everyone. Thank you for all your support.
yeah, take it easy,
Christmas.
folks.
Bye.